Hello, and welcome back to History Videos for Kids. Today, we are going to be talking about the Crimean War. That's right, another war. This all started in the year of 1853. The Ottoman Turks ruled the country Palestine. Palestine had the cities of Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. These cities were of big importance to the Christians. Since the Ottoman Turks, who were Muslims, ruled over Palestine, knew how important these places were to the Christians, they were extra careful not to upset them. They gave France and England and some other countries parts of the Holy Land to care for. Of course, this wasn't the ideal for the Christians, but it seemed like it might be okay. But Nicholas I, ruler of Russia, decided to make the mess bigger. He wanted to capture Constantinople so that his Russian ships could sail through the Black Sea, which runs next to the land, and into the Mediterranean. England was very scared of Russia and their threats. Nicholas was hoping that the British army would join forces with them so that they would have a likelier chance of winning. In return for the help, Nicholas would distribute the land evenly with them. Unfortunately for Nicholas, the English believed that Russians were savage, wild people. Even though Nicholas made sure that he was very polite and professional, and even told Victoria how amazing her husband was, because he knew how much she loved hearing that, she still thought he was uncivilized and savage. One of Victoria's government officials said that if the Russians were able to establish power in Europe, it would be the downfall of the human race. France then also decided to add more chaos to the mix, and they too went before Victoria, hoping to make an alliance with Britain. They hated the Turks, but could tolerate them because they weren't very strong. But they also strongly disliked the Russians, and unlike the Turks, the Russians were strong and growing more and more powerful by the minute. Now Louis-Philippe, the French king, was the first French king that visited England since 1356. The reason no French king had visited for so long was because the English and the French were not friends. They were more like enemies. Somehow, he was able to impress Victoria and Albert, and so the two nations joined together. At this time, Christians from Russia and France began to quarrel over who would protect the church in Bethlehem, which is where they believe Jesus was born. The French, along with the help of the British, were able to drive the Russians back home. Pretty soon, they decided that they should make the Russians even weaker. They planned to capture the Russian city Sevastopol, which is where the Russians kept their boats. They thought that if they could capture the city, the Russians would pretty much be helpless. The Russians fought ferociously. The war lasted for months and months, and since they were fighting on the Crimean Peninsula, the war was called the Crimean War. One of the fights in the battle was a very famous one, a battle where a small number of British troops marched towards Russia's large army, and where most of them breathed their last breath. This battle was so famous that eventually someone wrote a poem about it, called The Charge of the Light Brigade. While the British weren't very organized, the Russians weren't any better. The general messed up so many times that Nicholas I's son, named Alexander, fired him and appointed a new general. Nicholas was so outraged that he died of a stroke. Alexander was now the Tsar, and it only took a few more months until the French and British armies finally captured the city. It was 1856, and the Russians agreed to sign a treaty titled the Peace of Paris. Sevastopol would be given back to the Russians after they gave the Turkish land back to the Turks. They also had to pledge that they would not have warships in the Black Sea. And that is the crazy story of the build-up to the Crimean War, the fighting that took place during the war, and the end of the war. A very interesting fact is that the last veteran of the Crimean War died in 2004. It was a turtle whose name was Timothy. That became a British mascot of the Crimean War. We hope you enjoyed this skit. See you next time.